Calling all L&D professionals. What does learning really mean in 2025? What kind of environment is needed, and is it the one that is being created? The relationship between learning, leadership, technology, and organizational culture is evolving faster than ever. From AI-powered personalization to learning in the flow of work, the future is being shaped right now. But are people being connected to the learning that they need? And if they are, what is proving most effective? Joining me to explore this and more is Ani Acker. Ani, welcome to In Good Company. How are you?
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm doing very well, thank you. It's a rainy day here in New York, but I'm sure you're used to that.
Yes, we're very much used to the rain in this part of the world. We're in the
Yes.
northwest of the UK, so and we've not long since had quite a substantial storm. But so how are you today?
I'm doing very well, thank you. I appreciate the time, and I'm very excited to share some of my thoughts. They're all my opinions and the way I see things. So happy to hear people challenge me on that as well.
Yeah. Great. Well, I'm excited to get into the topic today. So, before we do that, let's give our audience the chance to get to know you a little bit better. So, why don't you tell us about yourself in 60 seconds?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been very passionate about learning. I've been in this business for over 25 years, and I started, in a very kind of obscure way, doing some training for women who were displaced, who were trying to get back to work, and really fell in love with with kind of the aspect of learning and how people learn. And so I've been doing it for over 25 years as in multiple different capacities in
Mm.
consulting, as head of learning for organizations. And I'm a little known as a little bit of a disruptor. I like to come in and kind of rethink, reimagine. Although many times we're constrained with the environments that we're part of, which we want to tackle today. But I do like to think a little bit about trying to pull people to the next frontier and bringing them to the next level of learning, because things change all the time, and we have to change with that. And so
Mm.
I'm very passionate about that, and I want to make sure that we are sharing with other L&D professionals and others in the business how we can really take this to the next level.
Excellent. Well, let's get straight into it. So we've gone quite big with this topic, but let's hear your perspective on what the environment is like for people in learning and development right now. So what challenges are they dealing with when it comes to the future of learning, and how is it different from, say, 5 years ago?
Yeah, it's very interesting because in the last couple of months, I've been talking to a lot of people, but I think it also depends on the organization, the company, as well as the environment that L&D professionals are in. Oftentimes they're brought in to kind of do the traditional learning and development function, and I think what happens is a lot of L&D professionals are still kind of grappling or doing things the way that they used to, and I think that's we feel like as L&D professionals, we've come a long way, like
Mm.
things have changed, technology has changed, learning management systems are doing things, skills has been introduced, but really the way that we're doing what we do as learning professionals has not changed quite a bit, right? And so I
Yeah.
still talk to a lot of people where they're still saying, hey, you know what, we have learning professionals who come in and sit with the business, and all they want to do is design or develop content the way they feel is the right way to do it, rather than listening to the business, and being consultative, and kind of, again, just the skill set has not evolved. We're struggling. I think a lot of people talk about Gen AI, but again, I don't know how that gets integrated, but we have to really think about L&D professionals. Right now is the right time for us to say, okay, what are the new skills that we need? How do we change the way we work with organizations? What's our role, right? Like, what else do we need to do in order for us to make impactful, work actually matter, right? And actually bring it to the business in a way that matters. And I think, one thing that they struggle with, which I see often, is L&D tends to kind of be very insular. They talk L&D.
Mm.
They don't talk the language of the business, right?
Right.
They have to really kind of start to think about, in terms of the business. They have to really understand how to be entrepreneurs, right? They have to think about how, if they weren't L&D, right, like how they would function in that business. And I think that's and being able to be, kind of aligned to where that business is going. So yeah, a lot hasn't changed, unfortunately, from my view. I think there's like maybe 2-3%, top 2-3%, where you have very visionary learning professionals who are kind of driving it to the next level. There's a lot of talk, but I think when it comes to the application, we are still stuck in that old way of doing things, and that's I think a struggle. And the businesses don't feel like they have good partners in us, right? And so when you talk to a business person about L&D, they'll roll their eye. They're like, yeah, they've developed this content for us, right? But
Yeah,
they
yeah.
don't talk about the impact that we can bring and or that we've brought.
Yeah, there's a lot, picking up on what you said there, there's a lot about the context is everything, and the not necessarily, yeah, context over content is highly important.
Yep.
And it's interesting to hear that you kind of, despite changes being constant, that in many ways the world of L&D hasn't changed. What do you think, if anything, does need to change in that world?
Everything.
Right. Okay.
I I think the time is right now.
Okay.
We need what I call an L&D revolution.
Right.
We still talk about Addy. We still talk about Kirkpatrick. We still talk about, these methodologies and frameworks and, things that are from the 70s and the 60s and the 80s. There's nothing wrong with that. I don't think that there's anything wrong with that, because those were created at a time when you needed a framework to start to really think about how L&D can be an enabler, right, in an organization. So, for the lack of anything, those worked right at that time when we just started in the industry. But the business is changing. Like if you look around, everything is changing at a very massive speed, and clinging to like these frameworks and methodologies, or not even trying to adapt them, right, to where the business is, and thinking differently about those things, it's just going to lead us to failure. And I think
Right.
we're seeing that, because we're seeing, I talked to a number of people where they say, you know what, our CEO wants to have an L&D organization. They don't understand the value. And that's very painful for me to hear, because I think if anything, CEOs need to be driving this effort. But when they don't see the value that we bring, they're not going to be on board to help us or fund us, or give us the investment that we need. So we it's everything is changing, and we need to change completely. I think in every aspect we have to think about measurement differently. We have to think about how we design content. We need to think about how we think about learners as consumers, right? Think about marketing organizations. Think about like how big companies market to consumers, right? And we have to start to bring those thoughts and those methodologies into the way that we work. Social media is blowing up, but we haven't captured it. We haven't really thought about how that could be something that we can leverage, right, where we're working. We can't be this club anymore, the L&D club, and only talk in language that we understand. We kind of have to start to push ourselves into the business and start being more kind of open to thinking about learning in a different way, and kind of letting go of these like shackles of
Yeah.
the
So
element.
what then would you say is a great starting point for an organization that's hearing what you're saying then and going, right, okay, I want to make a start to change that? What would you say would be a good way of doing that?
That's a good question. It depends on who's asking, right? If it's a CEO, they're going to have to put, kind of their the money where it belongs, and bring in visionary L&D people and challenge them, right? And not challenge them for a year, and then a year later, when things are a little bit tough, pull it back, because you really need that consistency. You have to have a nice long runway where you're willing to say, hey, you know what, like we really want our organization to be different. How we empower our people, how we drive growth within our organization, if that is the culture that we want to create, then we have to put our money where our mouth is, and actually do it. But we also have to think about even CHROs have to stop thinking about bringing L&D professionals in the old mindset that they had, right? And so sometimes you have L&D professionals who come in with the great intent to do a lot of great things, but then they hit walls because they're multiple layers below, right? In an HR organization that doesn't see the value, right? And
Yeah.
doesn't want to promote that. And they think that it's something that we offer rather than an actual enabler, right, of
Mm.
growth and productivity in an organization. So you really have to change the mindset, and you have to get the CEOs and you have to get CHROs behind this,
Yeah.
and start to look for visionary leaders and give them the right, give them the investment that they can, and give them the space to
Yeah.
experiment and actually do this in the right way.
I mean, yeah, if we were, obviously, what you're saying there speaks very closely to everything that Impact does and what we offer. And yeah, it's very, very nice to hear you say things like that, for sure. Because we go into organizations, we go through that process of starting off with a really strong listening phase and really learning what the business needs, as a way of developing that solution to guarantee, or as close to as possible to guarantee success. That we go into organizations and really want to learn the outcomes that they're trying to achieve, to then create a solution that works for them largely. And so it's been really interesting to hear from your perspective and your experience, where L&D is at, and where it could be, for organizations to get ahead of that curve and almost future-proof themselves by doing so, and be more sustainable. So it's
you bring up a very good point. The listening, I think, is what's lacking, right? And I'm sure, like, you have amazing, talented Impact who, when they're sitting, they're all experts, right, in leadership development and learning, and they're listening to the business, and they know the answer, right? And they might have an idea of what the answer is, but you really have to hold yourself.
Sure.
And you really have to listen. And I think that's where we lack the ability to be effective. Is we don't listen to our to the people, to the employees, to the leaders. We actually are thinking about what we want to say next, versus really actually being thoughtful listener and translating that and taking the time to think about, okay, like, what am I hearing here? Not just the words that are coming out, right?
Absolutely. We speak about listening as a key leadership skill in itself, and we like to think that we do that in any time we're going in with clients. That's exactly, it's paramount to really for the work that we do. We wouldn't be able to do it without listening to do it successfully. So but then it has that knock-on effect where if we're practicing that, and then leaders can start to practice the listening skills as well. It's really powerful. It's really powerful.
Yeah.
I wanted to move on, because you work with organizations to help them with this learning in their business strategy. How do we've talked a bit about the kind of need for change to happen and for it to really work. So how do you build that culture? Where does it so how do you change that perspective from something that's just going to cost the business money, but that's going to have that sustainable effect into the future?
Yeah, when I was years ago when I was at MetLife, I led a program with the IT called Student of the Business, right? Because we wanted IT to be more aligned with the business strategy. I think rule number one: be a student of the business. You really have to go in and understand each aspect of the business. It's almost like you have to become an expert in almost every function in the organization. I can go in and talk to product development, about product strategies, because I've read up and I've done work with that. And I do my homework before I go in, but I also don't say things that make me look like I am just saying it because I just read it, right? I say it from a place of, like, I've actually implemented something, and I actually know the pain points. If I'm talking to engineers, I have to be versed in what AWS is, or Google Cloud, or Python. I really need to understand the reality and be a student of that, to really then think about how do I aligning learning to business. Oftentimes what happens is, chief learning officers or heads of learning think about only okay, what's the business vision for the next 5 years? And that's really important, right? You need to think about where's the business headed, what are the priorities for the CEO and the C-suite, or, kind of what are we trying to achieve? Where are our gaps? You absolutely need to do that. But that's just scratching the surface, because that's just very kind of high level. You really then have to you have to dig deeper. You have to go in and start to have conversations, listening, right? What I call listening sessions, and start to really kind of align at that level, right? And if you have to do it not just at the leadership level, you have to do it with employees, because in order for you to start to get credibility and actually when the time is right and you want to do something and you want to actually kind of present something or offer something, you want that credibility to be there, and you want people to actually say, wow, I was looking forward to that because we had a conversation about it, and we talked about it, and I'm excited about kind of thinking how I integrate that. So you bring the business along the ride with you. It's not about you sitting like in your own room trying to think about looking at decks and reading kind of objectives and then trying to make sense out of it and thinking, oh, what kind of skills do we need in the future? What are the pain points in the organization? You're only going to do that when you go in and start having a conversation. And so that's, I think, rule number one: be a student of the business, be a good listener, learn, and it's your business. You're going to have to support them. So you can't say, I know nothing about accounting. You need to know about accounting.
Yeah.
You do need to speak every language, right? And for every department. But in order for us to do this, like, again, it's being kind of the enabler. What I call is the business is your partner in co-designing and in co-influencing, right? And so I can't influence alone. I need them, because it's all about, right? Like you know it, right? If it goes viral, then I know that I've done my job and people are excited. And I want people to come to me and ask, not for me to push. So I think in order for me to do that, I have to put the business in the room with me and say, okay, how can we design this together? Like it's not about what I think you need. It's how do we do this together? And let's, put some flip charts up and actually do it together, right? And so I think when they own it, then you've truly aligned with the business strategy, because then they're ready for it and then they want it.
And I love what you were saying about the being a student of the business. I really like that phrase, and particularly, and going back to that listening piece and the having conversations and the learning about your own business and the people within it. All of that builds a huge amount of trust, particularly like you say, if you're emotionally and personally and invested in the change that you want to see and the growth that you want to make, then the people around you will build that sense of trust. And I think that's a massive crucial part for success, isn't it? Because if there isn't any trust, then it's not going to go anywhere.
You're absolutely right. And it doesn't take much. It really doesn't. You don't need to be an expert, right? But you really you have to understand the reality, right? And you have to be kind of in the trenches with them and say, okay, like, I get it. I get what show me, or, I've done my homework, right? And so, and I think that is a skill, right? Like I call it a consulting skill, because, years ago when we used to get assigned projects when we were in consulting, whether I was at IBM or anywhere else, you went in and you knew nothing about the client, and you had to learn very quickly everything about that client so that you can speak intelligently and earn their trust very quick, because your project only can last a month or 2 months or 3 months, right? And so you have to earn trust within that first week. So you have to learn to do that quickly, but you have to be a learner yourself, and you have to be open to hear and understand, and explore and kind of just be curious. Ask the questions. I mean, don't go in thinking you're an expert. Don't walk, because that actually just turns it off, right? Don't go in,
and people can see right through it.
But ask questions. Like, if you don't know the answer, ask questions. Don't pretend.
Definitely. And I think other challenges that are faced at the moment is we've talked a lot about technologically I'll say that again. We've talked a lot about technology and the advancements and the pace of those advancements, and particularly, I think what's becoming also more apparent is the sort of the multi-generational divide. The way that hybrid working has kind of become the norm. We're hearing more about adaptive learning, learning in the flow of work. I know you've written an article on that fairly recently. Tailoring experiences to meet people where they're at. Is it possible to balance all of this or any of it? What would be? Is there a one size fits all environment to create and learning for people to learn at their best, or does it have to be tailored?
I don't know that it needs it always needs to be tailored, because for it to be adaptive, that means that you're trying to meet people where they're at, right? And
Mm,
so that means that the kind of this old idea of, like, let me bring, kind of tons of content, right? And then, people will sift through it and figure out what's right for them. That just doesn't work anymore, right?
mm,
It has its place. I'm not saying that it doesn't, and you kind of have to have these things available. But we've kind of what we've done is, we went away from this. Like, we flooded the market, learning market, with content.
mm,
And there's so much content, and it's hard for you to kind of figure out what is what. So you do need to start to think about how you tailored it. I don't know that there's a clear answer, like an easy answer for this, because I
yeah.
think it depends on the organization you're walking into, the scope, right? The big, but you can start small. You can think about, doing things that can start to open up that process and start to engage people in a different way. So our current learning system ecosystem does not support adaptive learning at all. And I don't care what anybody tells me. I don't think it does, because the minute that you have created a platform, a learning management system, or a learning experience platform, all you're doing is, it's again compiling everything into one place where someone has to go and search and find. It might offer up things based on your, kind of the AI, the algorithm. It might offer up
Mm,
some things along the way, but it's still not in that flow of work. I don't think it happens. I think in order for us to think about in the flow of work, we have to kind of forget about all of that ecosystem and say,
mm,
okay, you know what, like, where do I, what are the systems that are available where I can insert some of these things, where I can meet people where they're at? How can I engage the experts in the business to actually be the people who talk about the content, right? Like, why am I going and bringing in expertise from outside when I have experts internally? And peer-to-peer expertise is much more, right, credible, because I can learn from somebody. And if I do this in a social way, hey, like what I mentioned it in my article, like TikTok for the corporate environment, think about
mm,
that. You can actually go a long way with that. I think that it can start small. You can balance a little bit, but that's why the revolution is needed, because we have
yeah.
to start to think, okay, where do we start to change and disrupt the industry so that we are creating ecosystems that actually support that.
It's really fascinating because, I mean, I've worked for Impact now for 11 years,
Yeah.
and we stem a lot of our USP, if you like, is working around experiential learning.
Yep.
And it's really fascinating to kind of hear, as we talk to other clients as well, about how their organization learns best, how their people learn best. And we're still deep rooted in pivotal moments coming from experiences that people go through. We often use I often use a car, learning to drive a car analogy. You learn to pass your test, but really you learn to drive once you've passed your test, don't you? And it's
Yeah.
it's you going through your own experience. And I wonder how that's changing with the people's attention spans, like you say, people wanting the kind of the TikTok learning style. Is that right, or is it because the people that maybe people have only experienced that, haven't necessarily experienced, say, a face-to-face learning program, as an example? And I wonder where the best of both worlds is, for people to kind of have those. I wonder if people are having those real, tangible, pivotal moments from TikTok style learning. There is
Yeah.
definitely, as you said, a place for that. But is it and maybe there's a generational thing there as well. I don't know. If I
Well,
knew the answer, I'd probably be a lot richer.
I don't think it's generational, by the way.
Yeah.
I'm obsessed. Like I have my reels that I go through and I learn things. I don't think it's generational. I think everybody is in it. But
Mm,
here's how I look at it, right? We actually, it's not one or, right? It's not, and I think that's where we went wrong. So I think now more than ever, we need to be more experiential than we've ever been in learning. So as I
mm,
was saying, right? So we've hit a slump in L&D. Like, years back, what happened was everything used to be ILT. And then everybody went, crazy with oh, it costs money, travel. And then we focused on this concept of, and everybody talked about a democratization of learning, right? And so we're like, hey, biggest amount of content that I can like push on employees.
yeah.
I'll pay hundreds and thousands of dollars for LinkedIn Learning, and 20,000 titles are available in any topic, anything you want. It's
Mm,
there for you, right? Now go and learn, and that's what we
yeah.
did. So we kind of, we what is it? Swung the pendulum to the others, to the one extreme to the other. I think there's a common or a good middle ground here, right? I think so. Going back to the roots of how learning professionals think about content. So when you want to teach people about certain things, there's different experiences you can create that's going to actually drive behavior change. But show me one person who has actually changed their behavior by listening to a and I'm not knocking LinkedIn Learning. I look at it all the time.
Yeah. Yeah.
Look, like listening to someone talk about, coaching skills, right? Show me one person who's become an expert in that. There isn't. So the only way that people become experts in something or build a skill is when they actually experience. That's the experiential. The
Mm,
experience, they're actually doing something and they're actually learning, getting feedback, and having the opportunity to experiment, right?
yeah.
So I think that's the piece where we cannot say you can't have experiential learning. In fact, I will just say that just recently, when I was at Salonis, people were excited about being in in-person events, right? They
Mm,
didn't mind taking half a day off or a day off because they were actually finally learning something and they could apply it. They were getting feedback in the session, and it was giving them the time to focus on themselves. So there's nothing wrong with that. I don't believe that you have to have one or the other. I think the key here is how do you actually leverage all of these different things, but in the right way,
yeah.
at the
Yeah.
right moment, and in a way that actually gets people excited and engaged about it, right? So we have to think about the engagement model, and how do we actually, what are we trying to do? The experiential piece has to be part of it. Like, you cannot, it's not, we can't, we even if you want to offer up a video, a self-paced video, there has to be something alongside it that actually allows a learner to experience that, whether I
Yeah,
give an
definitely.
opportunity to apply or talk about whatever it may be. But you have to have something that provides that. It can't just be the one or the other anymore.
Yeah, definitely. We often, I hear a lot, although I don't directly deliver our solutions to clients. I do work a lot on them, and we've found that a lot of our programs were sort of solely face to face for many years, and then of course
Yeah.
some global event happened a few years ago that obviously meant that, and we were delivering programs in other ways prior to that, of course, but that really meant that we had to change things quickly, as we did the whole world. But I hear some great stuff, like we have truly blended solutions now, where
Yeah.
we have a face-to-face element where it's possible, and a lot of experiential virtual content, and exercises and facilitated exercises delivered all around the world, and it seems to be a really good way of people learning. But yeah, there is an interesting shift that's happening with like attention spans and AI, and it's another interesting point where we're kind of finding what's the right way that people want because there's got to be a want there, hasn't there? That
Yeah.
people
Yeah.
the way they want to learn. So yeah, it's a fascinating time we find ourselves in. So
It
on
is.
that, then looking towards the future, in your opinion, what's the maybe I've already said it. What's the sort of the learning trend on the horizon that you might be excited about, or is wondering that could take off? Perhaps it's not just those two letters that we're hearing a lot of at the moment.
I know, right? Like, should we say Gen AI? But listen, I, I think that the opportunities are like the what is it? Like the path is in front of us, right? And I think I'm like almost thinking like we need a consortium of like these visionary learning leaders who are going to come and say no more. We are
Mm,
going to kind of craft a whole new path for L&D, and it's going to look very different. And we're going to start to inspire entrepreneurs and software developers to actually maybe start developing platforms that make sense. And and we need designers who are actually designing more animated stuff, and not, and I don't mean cartoon animation, but things that are like more in motion, that engage people, and are a lot more relevant. And the experiential, right, like the create new exercises to create more experiential moments, whether virtual or not, even self-paced, right? So you can reimagine all of this in a very different way. So I think the path is very clear. AI is a great enabler, right? But
mm,
but I think that what most people are struggling with is what does it mean to me? And they're still trying to grapple with that. And I think L&D will probably be one of the last industries that will kind of get, but they should be at the forefront of it because there's so many benefits to them, right? That they can integrate Gen AI into their work and figure out a way to actually help them be better, right? And
yeah,
actually be a little bit or help them disrupt the status quo, right?
yeah,
And I think there's a lot of I think there's a lot of game changers that L&D needs to harness. But I think there's a fear, not a fear, but I think what happens is most L&D heads of L&D organizations don't have the support of their business or don't have the support of their CHROs, and oftentimes are pushed back down to what we know best, right? Like, tell me how many courses people have completed, like that kind of sort of mentality. So I don't know. I think I don't see any trends. I see the experiential piece having a big place, social learning, but I think that this is the time for us to jump on it and say, okay, how do we do this, and how do we do this in a different way?
mm. There's a lot to think about, and
Um,
it's exciting. It is an exciting time we find ourselves in. I think
yeah,
there's we're nobody's sat twiddling thumbs. That everybody's kind of really looking to using tools to make the best of and apply what we already know to that, and to work alongside it rather than against it, and all those kind of things. So it's a fascinating time. What an amazing conversation! Thank you so much for giving us your time, Annie.
thank you.
I've really enjoyed the last half an hour. It's been truly insightful, and I really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
I've got one final question for you, which I know just offline we were talking about this, that you've put lots of thought into. So I'm very excited to hear your answer. So our last question to you, which is what we ask all of our guests, is if you had the opportunity to talk to your younger self about your future, what would be the best advice you'd give your younger self?
Oh wow. So first thought was, run away and don't look back. I'm kidding. And then I thought, like, the second thought, which I shared with you, was, but I did everything so well. Like, I really wouldn't change any of it. I've had to learn the hard way on a couple of things, and I did put a little bit of thought into that because I really wanted to think. I have a 21-year-old daughter, and I was like thinking, if I was in her shoes now, right, starting my kind
Mm,
of my career, and thinking about like my path ahead, what would be one thing like that actually would have helped me, right, do this differently? And I would just say, hey, listen, one thing that keeps coming up is learn to navigate company politics early on,
right.
and learn to because I got into quite a bit of trouble early in my career because I
Okay.
didn't know how to. Because what happened was I kind of created a group of people that are around me that I really really was connected with. But you really need to kind of, when you stick to that, it's very hard, right, to then expand your network and actually become more kind of integrated with the business. So
Were you almost too disruptive? Is that what happened with it?
Yeah, I know, right?
Yeah.
You
Finding
have
the boundaries quickly.
you
Yeah,
do,
yeah.
right? But you have to build allies, right? In
Mm,
every, and I don't mean by allies only leaders who can help you, but people have voice, employees have voice, and so you do need that ally network. And so I would just say, whatever you're starting, whatever career you're in, whether it's L&D or not, and in L&D, I think it becomes even more important. Go out there and build those allies and network as much as possible, and do that early on, right? Because that network is going to help you. I learned a little bit the hard way, but then once I figured it out, which was very quick. I mean, I had just left IBM, and I was like, I don't think I did what I needed to do there. And so, and that hurt me, right? And I didn't have a network. And so I kind of very quickly made that my priority. And ever since then, I make it a point to connect with people and build relationships. And sometimes they come in handy, and sometimes they don't. But I've met some really amazing people along the way, and that I've learned from, and who have given me a lot of good advice and have been great supporters right when I needed them.
Yeah, and that's been fascinating, and that's just again demonstrated the power of experiential learning, isn't it? Because you have learned from that experience, by being, I guess, possibly both courageous, maybe a tad naive as well, but exploring boundaries and again learning from it. So normally I sort of challenge back and sort of say, do you live by your own advice? But it sounds like you definitely do.
I try,
Yeah.
I sometimes get lazy, but but I try. And listen, you meet some very interesting people along the way. It enriches your life, and it enriches your career. Like, to know so many people. Just recently, I mean, a lot of people have kind of popped up from my network that I haven't spoken to in years, and it's been great to reconnect and kind of reestablish relationships and know where they're at with their journey, and you never stop learning. So it's a very rich place to be in, when you have that kind of network.
Amazing. Ani, thank you so much. That's been a really great conversation. Thank you. And that just leaves me to say that if you'd like to find any more about Impact, or perhaps you'd like to find out more about Ani and the work she does, then you'll find all of the links that you need in where you found today's episode. So thank you one more time to Ani for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And until the next time, take care.